Budget leaks were once resignation offences, but the pressures of news management now predominate. The government really needs this tax cut to land with the public in order to dent Labour's enormous poll lead. But will the Chancellor have other surprises in his red box? Jeremy Hunt has no shortage of problems to solve. Growth is sluggish, the UK is in recession, household finances are under pressure, as are public finances. None of it's a walk in the park. We'll be looking at what the Chancellor does say, debating what he doesn't, and we will bring you instant analysis of what it all means for you.
Yes, I'll be here to tell you what the Chancellor is likely to announce.
Political editor Robert Peston is in Westminster to tell you why he's doing it, and we'll hear from economics editor Joel here on whether or not he can afford it. So welcome to this special programme on the Chancellor's budget.
This is ITV News, the Chancellor's Budget Special with Tom Bradby.
Good afternoon. It is Budget Day with an election looming and the government so far behind in the opinion polls they are more or less out of sight. So there are urgent economic and indeed political questions for the Chancellor to address today. No one watching this programme will need any reminding that the cost of living squeeze has been immensely painful. The country is also technically in recession, and more than that, we've had years and years now of sluggish growth. But no one will need any reminding either that our public finances are also under huge pressure. The head of the government's economic watchdog warned after the autumn statement that the public spending plans adopted by both main parties for the years ahead did not even merit being termed fiction. Ouch. So the real question today may be, does any of it add up? As you can see, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition are at the dispatch box, but they're just the warm-up act. In a few minutes, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, will take to his feet in just a few minutes' time. That's where Robert is taking in the action, and Joel, our economics editor, is here with me. But first, let's go to Anushka for a summary of the financial backdrop to today's budget. Anushka.
Thank you, Tom. I want to start by talking about so-called headroom that can suddenly change the amount the Chancellor has to spend. The reason why in December Jeremy Hunt might have been smiling was because he thought he had billions extra to play with. Why? Well, one big factor was expectations around interest rates. New forecasts suggested interest rates would fall quicker than expected, dropping below 3% rather than 4%. That meant Jeremy Hunt thought he'd be spending less on debt interest and so have more for other giveaways. But then in February, the forecast rose again, with a gap of about 0.8% in late 2025, which might sound small, but is very expensive. Ben Zaranko from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who did this analysis, tells me that was £10 billion suddenly gone. So, a less happy Jeremy Hunt, perhaps, whose hopes for tax cuts suddenly depended on finding more money. In which case, why not nick a Labour policy? We now hear he could ditch the non-dom status. There is debate on how much that raises. The IFS say up to around £2 billion, and it would pull the rug from under Labour's spending plans. We're also expecting a tax on vaping products, which, along with higher tobacco duty, could raise another £500 million. It's all to find money to spend on things like extending a 5p cut to fuel duty. I'm also hearing today he will extend the Household Support Fund, which supports families struggling to pay for meals after a lot of lobbying from local councils. There'll be an £800 million to boost productivity in the public sector, including with AI, and a new suggestion this morning that he could raise the threshold at which child benefit is paid. But the centrepiece that Jeremy Hunt has been fighting hardest to protect is that cut to national insurance. A 1p cut would cost £4.5 billion. They were worrying about going further, but we now know they will cut it by 2p, costing £9 billion. A lot of money, but cheaper than income tax because only those in work pay. Will it change this? That is our tax burden. It measures tax as a proportion of GDP. So the more tax the Treasury asks of us, the higher it goes. And it is due to hit record levels, above what it was back in 1948 after the war. The IFS say a 2% cut to national insurance contributions will do this. Not much. So if Jeremy Hunt wants to get that down, he'll have to find other tax cuts as well today.
It's just the way you tell it, Anushka. That is one sobering graph, isn't it? Joel, that leads me to ask you what you're looking out for today.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what he's not going to roll back the tax burden. This is going to be a big tax-raising parliament. I think the question I'll be looking for is now really a good time to be cutting taxes? Put it another way, would he not be cutting taxes if this wasn't an election year? If you look at it, as Anushka was pointing out, the outlook for growth is really weak. Inflation is easing, but interest rates are high. The government's paying more on its debt. That debt pile is still growing in the short term, despite the government's pledge to get it falling. Public services are in all sorts of problems. Councils are going bust left, right and centre. As Liam Byrne might put it, if he was still in the Treasury, there's no money left. As the IMF did put it in January, now is not the time to cut taxes. Arguably, the Chancellor should be raising them.
The great Liam Byrne note, possibly one of the most regretted notes of all time. Robert, let's go to you. What will you be looking out for today?
Well, mostly about precisely what you've heard from both, Anushka and Joel, which is the affordability of all of this. The tax burden will not fall very much, partly because there are going to be lots and lots of taxes being put up to raise more money, not the ones that are the most famous ones, but as Anushka said, if you're introducing a new tax on vapes, if you're abolishing the tax breaks for non-DOMs, particularly the non-DOM one, I don't think it's going to cost the Tories enormous numbers of votes, though it will have potentially quite an interesting, possibly negative economic impact. We'll have to wait and see. But the reality is, for a party that wants taxes to come down, I don't think we'll see anything terribly pronounced in that way. But as you said earlier on, in a way the biggest issue is if you're taking 2 pence in the pound off the national insurance burden for millions of individuals, will that translate into greater popularity for the Tory party? A Tory party that at the moment, its popularity is very much down in the dumps, as you said.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Robert is about to go and take his seat to watch the Chancellor's speech. He'll be back with us with his thoughts later, and we'll be right back after this break to find out exactly what is included in this year's budget. back. We are now just minutes away from hearing what Jeremy Hunt has in store for us in his budget. As you can see, PMQs is still going on, but the Chancellor is sat beside the Prime Minister and will be on his feet shortly. We'll bring you his speech in full as soon as he is on his feet. But Anushka and Joel are here to talk. I mean, I think it's best, just hearing what you had said at the start, to just elaborate a little bit on the content, and we'll wait and see what he says, but let's just go into it with a clear sense of the context. I mean, I guess my obvious question, hearing what you both had to say earlier, is there any point in anyone cutting taxes before an election if they're just going to have to put them up again after the election?
Well, we know that the governments tend to cut taxes just before an election. We know that newly elected governments or re-elected governments tend to put taxes up. I mean, those things are... history teaches us that those things are true.
Yeah.
Look, all budgets are political. This one is more political than ever. And I think one of the struggles that both parties have got, both of the main parties, in a year when people have to make very important choices about who forms the next government, is on economic strategy. There's very little to choose between them. Labour is desperately staying as close to the Tories as it can, and the Tories desperately want to do something different. So today, I think, is about positioning. I think we're going to hear from the Chancellor about positioning the party as the low-tax party. We are going to allow you to hold on to more of your hard-earned cash. That's popular, but he cut taxes.
Is it popular, though? Because we read in polls that people quite want public finances to improve.
Well, there's the rub, isn't it? Because if he's funding that tax cut by squeezing public services beyond the election further, then will people think it's credible? Will people believe that this is going to be a permanent tax cut? We'll have to look at how he plans to fund it.
I feel like that's the perfect question for you. Will people believe it?
Well, I think it's interesting what you say about, is it popular? Every poll we look at suggests that people would rather have spending on public services rather than tax cuts if you put them against each other. So what are they trying to do here? They're trying to target the voting groups that they think are most likely to swing towards them in the next election. So, for example, if they raise the £50,000 threshold at which families start to lose child benefit, that is going to go to an area that they think, the Conservatives think, they've got good chance of winning some of those people back. They also are desperate for people to feel better before the next election. I mean, I asked Rishi Sunak about this recently. I was like, if you were honest, wouldn't you say what you said when you were Chancellor, which is actually you should raise national insurance in order to raise money to spend on the NHS and spend on social care? And he sort of said, oh, yeah, if you've got a new plan, you do have to do that. But right now we want to put money back in people's pockets. I think the difficulty is, at the same time as taking 2p off national insurance, which is a headline rate, which people understand, they continue to freeze the personal allowance threshold.
That tax graph you showed us was one of the most elaborating and
millions of extra people are going into income tax and are going into the higher rate. It is a kind of stealth raid, if you like. People don't realise it's happening, but they still feel less well off.
But let's be clear also, one of the reasons the tax burden has risen, too, for the UK, quite a historically high level, but compared to other advanced economies below the sort of average tax burden, is because of what's happened over the last 3 years. We've been hit by two absolutely colossal economic shocks. The government spent the best part of £400 billion providing support to households and businesses. We shouldn't forget that. That is not, some of that had to be borrowed.
Just before we get there, I just point out that people are watching the chamber there. Prime Minister's questions will give way to the Chancellor on his feet very shortly. The Speaker does have a habit of enjoying letting Prime Minister's questions run on, so we'll wait to see how much he likes to keep the Chancellor waiting, but we'll cut to it as soon as we get it. I guess my question, though, is, does anyone watching this have good reasons to believe either main party in terms of their economic plan going forward?
I mean, just on that, trust in politicians is the lowest I have ever seen it. I think it might even be the lowest that it has ever been measured. Something like 12% in a recent poll I saw believe politicians will tell the truth. I mean, that is a bigger problem that we're dealing with right now that I think is linked to a series of crises that the country has been through, and this loss of trust is catastrophic, and whoever wins the next election really has to try to build that back. In terms of COVID, though, and I think this is really interesting, in 2010, we all remember the election in 2010. It wasn't Gordon Brown's fault that there had been a financial crisis, arguably, but the Conservatives absolutely made the country feel like it was Gordon Brown's fault. And so who can blame Labour for doing the same now? They're absolutely going to make everyone feel that it's all the Conservative government's fault, whilst Rishi Sunak will be saying, don't forget COVID, don't forget what happened. And, you know, we talked about that Liam Byrne note where they said there's no money left. I mean, that feeds into the same type of thing we're going through now. And maybe is partly why you don't always get that trust in politicians, because there's a bit of a dishonest debate. No one's really willing to have the kind of difficult conversations that you need to have about, for example, the intractable issue of fixing the NHS.
Yeah, exactly. If the Chancellor were being entirely transparent today, he might stand up and say, listen, I want to cut taxes, and I think that's the right thing to do. But that means making some difficult decisions. And today, I think we should make the following sacrifices. I guarantee you he will not say that. What he will say is something about we're going to cut taxes because it's going to revive our economic prospects. And he will leave unsaid and uncertain and unspecified where the cuts are going to come to public services. That's one for the election.
OK, well, let's go and have a look at what is happening in the Commons, because we think the Chancellor is about to get to his feet. Of course, his budget will be answered today not by the Shadow Chancellor, but by the Leader of the Opposition. That is the way these things are done, and that is the tradition. And actually, it's one of the most difficult things that the Leader of Opposition ever has to do. He gets no warning of the Chancellor's speech and has to respond on his feet. Here we go. Here is the Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as we mourn the tragic loss of life in Israel and Gaza, the Prime Minister reminded us last week of the need to fight extremism and heal divisions. So I start today by remembering the Muslims who died in 2 world wars in the service of freedom and democracy. We need a memorial to honour them, so following representations from the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove and others, I've decided to allocate £1 million towards the cost of building one. Whatever your faith or colour or class, this country will never forget the sacrifices made for our future. Madam Deputy Speaker, in recent times the UK and the UK economy has dealt with a financial crisis, a pandemic and an energy shock caused by war in Europe. Yet despite the most challenging economic headwinds in modern history, under Conservative governments since 2010, growth has been higher than every large European economy. Unemployment has halved, absolute poverty has gone down, and there are 800 more people in jobs for every single day that we've been in office. Of course, interest rates remain high as we bring down inflation. But because of the progress we've made, because we are delivering the Prime Minister's economic priorities, we can now help families not just with temporary cost of living support, but with permanent cuts in taxation. We do this to give much needed help in challenging times, but also because Conservatives know lower taxes mean higher growth. And higher growth means more opportunity, more prosperity, and more funding for our precious public services. But if we want that growth...
What? The Chancellor has hardly said anything. Order! You can't get excited yet. Now, other people want to hear what the Chancellor has to say, and it's matters. So we'll have a bit of good behaviour, please. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If we want that growth to lead to higher wages and higher living standards for every family in every corner of the country, it cannot come from unlimited migration. It can only come by building a high-wage, high-skill economy, not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head. And that is the difference with the party opposite. Their plans destroy jobs, reduce opportunities, and risk family finances with spending that pushes up taxes. Instead of going back to square one, the policies I announced today mean more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes in a budget for long-term growth. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I start with the updated forecasts from the OBR, for which I thank Richard Hughes and his team. First, inflation. When the Prime Minister and I came to office, it was 11%. The latest figures show... I know the party opposite struck...
This is not amusing anymore. We need to hear what the Chancellor has to say. I can tell who's making the noise, and you simply won't get a chance to speak later. So that's the end of it. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Prime Minister and I came to office, inflation was 11%, but the latest figures show it is now 4%, more than meeting our pledge to halve it last year. And today's forecasts from the OBR show it falling below the 2% target in just a few months' time, nearly a whole year earlier than forecast in the autumn statement. That didn't happen by accident. Whatever the pressures and whatever the politics, a Conservative government working with the Bank of England will always put sound money first. But we also understand that tackling inflation, while necessary, is painful. It means higher interest rates and a period of lower growth. So we've given the average household £3,400 in cost of living support over the last 2 years. Doing so makes economic as well as moral sense. The OBR predicted real household disposable income per person would fall by 2% in the last year. Instead, after this support, it is on track to rise by 0.8%. And today I take further steps to help families with cost of living pressures, starting with measures to help the poorest families. We've already abolished higher charges for electricity paid by those on prepayment meters, increased the local housing allowance, and raised benefits by double expected inflation. Today I focus on those falling into debt. Nearly 1 million households on universal credit take out budgeting advance loans to pay for more expensive emergencies like boiler repairs or help getting a job. To help make such loans more affordable, I've today decided to increase the repayment period for new loans from 12 months to 24 months. For some people, I thought they cared about people on the lowest incomes. But trust the Labour Party not to want to hear about debt. For some people, the best way to resolve debt is through a debt relief order. But getting one costs £90, which can deter the very people who need them the most. So having listened carefully to representations from citizens' advice, I today relieve pressure on around 40,000 families every year by abolishing the £90 charge completely. Next, the Household Support Fund. It was set up on a temporary basis and due to conclude at the end of this month. Having listened carefully to representations from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Trussell Trust, and honourable members from East Ham, Colchester, Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and Suffolk Coastal, amongst others, I've decided that with the battle against inflation still not over, now is not the time to stop the targeted help it offers. We will therefore continue it at current levels for another 6 months. Next, I turn to a measure that will help businesses and households more broadly. In the autumn statement, I froze alcohol duty until August of this year. Without any action today, it would have been due to rise by 3%. But I've listened carefully to my right honourable friends from Altrincham and Sale West, the Vale of Glamorgan, and my right honourable friend from Murray, who is a formidable champion of the Scottish whisky industry. I also listened to Councillor John Tonks from Ash, a strong supporter of the wonderful Admiral pub, who pointed out the pressures facing the industry. So today I've decided to extend the alcohol duty freeze until February 2025. This benefits 38,000 pubs across the UK, and on top of the £13,000 saving a typical pub will get from the 75% business rates discount I announced in the autumn. We value our hospitality industry and are backing the great British pub. Another cost that families and businesses worry about is fuel. Now, the Shadow Chancellor complained about the freeze on fuel duty, and Labour has opposed it at every opportunity. The Labour Mayor of London wants to punish motorists even more with his ULEZ plans, but lots of families and sole traders depend on their car. If I did nothing, fuel duty would increase by 13% this month. So instead, I've listened to my right honourable friends for Stoke-on-Trent North, Dudley North, Witham and others, as well as the Sun newspaper's Keep It Down campaign. I have, as a result, decided to maintain the 5p cut and freeze fuel duty for another 12 months. This will save the average car driver £50 next year and bring total savings since the 5p cut was introduced to around £250. Taken together with the alcohol duty freeze, this decision also reduces headline inflation by 0.2 percentage points in 24/5, allowing us to make faster progress towards the Bank of England's 2% target. Madam Deputy Speaker, there can be no solid growth without solid finances. An economy based on sound money does not pass its bills to the next generation. When it comes to borrowing, some believe there is a trade-off between compassion and fiscal responsibility. They are wrong. It is only because we responsibly reduce the deficit by 80% between 2010 and 2019 that we could provide £370 billion to help businesses and families in the pandemic. The party opposite opposed our plans to reduce the deficit every single step of the way. But in fairness, they were consistent. The Lib Dems supported controlling spending in coalition, but now say they would prop up a party that will turn on the spending taps. It's the difference between no plan and no principles. And I'm delighted the right honourable gentleman from the Lib Dems was here to hear it for once. Today, we say something different. There is nothing compassionate about running out of money. With the pandemic behind us, we must once again be responsible and build up our resilience to future shocks. That means bringing down borrowing so we can start to reduce our debt. And today's figures confirm that is happening. Ahead of my first autumn statement in 22, the OBR forecast headline debt would rise to above 100% of GDP. Today, they will say it will fall in every year to just 94% by 28-29. Underlying debt, which excludes Bank of England debt, will be 91.7% in 24/5, according to the OBR, then 92.8%, 93.2%, 93.2% before falling to 92.9% in 28-29, with final year headroom against debt falling of £8.9 billion. Our underlying debt is therefore on track to fall as a share of GDP, meeting our fiscal rule. And we continue to have the second lowest level of government debt in the G7, lower than Japan, France or the United States. We also meet our second fiscal rule for public sector borrowing to be below 3% of GDP 3 years early. Borrowing falls from 4.2% of GDP in 23-24 to 3.1%, 2.7%, 2.3%, 1.6% and 1.2% in 2028-29. By the end of the forecast, borrowing is at its lowest level of GDP since 2001. None of that, of course, would be possible if Labour implemented their pledge to decarbonise the grid 5 years early by 2030. By their own calculations, that costs £28 billion a year to do. But last month, after flip-flopping for months, they said they're not going to spend the £28 billion after all, but somehow they'll meet their pledge. Somehow, Madam Deputy Speaker, can only mean one thing: tax rises on working families. Same old Labour. Today, in contrast, a Conservative government brings down taxes with borrowing broadly unchanged. In fact, borrowing is slightly lower than the autumn statement. And the fact that we are bringing borrowing down is something of particular importance to one very special person. Sir Robert Stamen is the outgoing Chief Executive of the Government's Debt Management Office. And after 20 years of exceptional public service, he is in the gallery. Thank you, Sir Robert. I now turn to growth. Just after I became Chancellor, the OBR expected GDP to fall by 1.4% in the following year. In fact, it grew, albeit slowly. Now the OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.8% this year and 1.9% next year, 0.5% higher than their autumn forecast. After that, growth rises to 2.2%, 1.8% and 1.7% in 2028. Since 2010, they don't want to hear this, but these are the facts. Since 2010, we have grown faster than Germany, France or Italy, the three largest European economies. And according to the IMF, we will continue to grow faster than all three of them in the 5 years ahead. Surveys by Lloyds and Deloitte show business confidence is returning. In other words, because we have turned the corner on inflation, we will soon turn the corner on growth. And today's OBR forecasts also show that we have made good progress on the Prime Minister's three economic priorities. Compared to when the three pledges were made, inflation has halved, debt is falling in line with our fiscal rules, and growth is fully 1.5 percentage points higher than predicted. And as growth returns, they don't have a growth plan, so they might as well listen to ours. As growth returns, our plan is for economic growth not sustained through migration, but one that raises wages and living standards for families. Not just higher GDP, but higher GDP per head, and that means sticking to our plan with a budget for long-term growth, more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. And I start with investment. Economists say that stimulating investment is the most effective way to raise productivity and therefore wages and living standards. Since 2010, we've been doing just that. Business, well, you might want to listen to what I'm about to say because business investment has risen from an average of 9.3% of GDP under Labour to 9.9% under the Conservatives. And this year it will be 10.6% of GDP. That is £30 billion more business investment than if it had continued at Labour levels. And it's still going up. In the short period since the autumn statement, Nissan have announced they'll build 2 new electric car models in the UK. Microsoft and Google have announced data centres worth over £3 billion. Thanks to my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, the Global Investment Summit unlocked £30 billion of investment. In fact, since 2010, greenfield foreign direct investment has been higher than anywhere else in Europe. And for the last 3 years, we have been the third highest in the world after the United States and China. And we're not stopping there. In the autumn statement, I announced we would introduce permanent full expensing, a £10 billion tax cut for businesses that gives the UK the most attractive investment tax regime of any large European or G7 country. It was welcomed by over 200 business leaders, with the CBI saying it was a game changer and the single most transformational thing we could do to fire up the British economy. And today I take further steps to boost investment. Having listened to calls from the CBI, Make UK and the BCC, we'll shortly publish draft legislation for full expensing to apply to leased assets, a change I intend to bring in as soon as it's affordable. We'll also help small businesses, something close to my own heart, as well as the business rate support and work on prompt payments I announced in the autumn. I'll provide £200 million of funding to extend the recovery loan scheme as it transitions to the growth guarantee scheme, helping 11,000 SMEs access the finance they need. And following representations from the Federation of Small Business, as well as honourable members for Loughborough, Southend West and Rother Valley, I will reduce the administrative and financial impact of VAT by increasing the VAT registration threshold from £85,000 to £90,000 from April the 1st, the first increase in 7 years. That will bring tens of thousands of businesses out of paying VAT altogether and encourage many more to invest and grow. I now move to measures to address historic underinvestment in our nations and regions. Since we started levelling up in 2019, 2/3 of all new salaried jobs have been created outside London and the South East. We've announced 13 investment zones and 12 free ports, which continue to attract investment, including recently, thanks to the efforts of Mayor Ben Houchen from the Numa Group, who are investing £15 million into the Tees Valley Investment Zone. Today, working with the Levelling Up Secretary, I devolve further power to local leaders who are best placed to promote growth in their areas. I can announce the North East Trailblazer devolution deal, providing a package of support for the region potentially worth over £100 million. I'll devolve powers to Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire and to the most beautiful county in England, Surrey. I see the Leader of the Opposition smiling because, like me, he is a Surrey boy. I know he's been taking advice from Lord Mandelson, who yesterday rather uncharitably said he needed to shed a few pounds. Ordinary families will shed more than a few pounds if that lot get in. Today, if he wants to join me on my marathon training, he's most welcome as well. Today, we continue to spread opportunity throughout the country by allocating £100 million of levelling up funding to areas including High Peak, Dundee, Conway, Erewash, Redditch and Coventry to support cultural projects in these communities, alongside support for capital projects across the country, including in Bingley. We are expanding the long-term plan for towns to 20 new places, including Darlington, home of the Treasury's fantastic Darlington Economic Campus, Coleraine, Peterhead, Runcorn, Harlow, Eastbourne, Arbroath and Rhyl, providing each with £20 million of funding to invest in community regeneration over the next decade. We'll provide £15 million in new funding to the West Midlands Combined Authority to support culture, heritage and investment projects on the recommendation of our go-getting Mayor Andy Street. And we'll allocate £5 million to renovate hundreds of local village halls across England so they can remain at the heart of their communities. And because this is a Conservative and Unionist government, we'll also set aside funding to support the Saxavord Spaceport in Shetland, an agri-food launch pad in mid-Wales, and funding to support Northern Ireland's businesses to expand global trade and investment opportunities. As a result of the decisions we take today, the Scottish Government will receive nearly £300 million in Barnett consequentials, with nearly £170 million for the Welsh Government and £100 million for the Northern Ireland Executive. I do appreciate that a tax-cutting budget is very uncomfortable for the biggest tax risers in the United Kingdom. We also want to level up opportunity across the generations, including building more houses for young people, and we're on track to deliver over 1 million homes in this Parliament. Last week, the Levelling Up Secretary allocated £188 million to support projects in Sheffield, Blackpool and Liverpool, and today I go further, allocating £242 million of investments in Barking Riverside and Canary Wharf, which together will build nearly 8,000 houses, as well as transforming Canary Wharf into a new hub for life science companies. We're launching a new £20 million community-led housing scheme supporting local communities to deliver the developments they want and need, and I'm pleased to announce the next steps for Cambridge to reach its potential to be the world's leading scientific powerhouse. I confirm there will be a long-term funding settlement for the Future Development Corporation in Cambridge at the next spending review, with over £10 million invested in the coming year to unlock delivery of crucial local transport and health infrastructure. The final levelling up measures I announced today support North Wales, where I have many happy childhood memories, in mould, following representations from the Honourable Member for the Vale of Clwyd. We will help fund the renovation of Theatre Clwyd. And I can announce this week the Government has reached agreement on a £160 million deal with Hitachi to purchase the Wilfer site in Innismarn and the Oldbury site in South Gloucestershire. Innismarn has a vital role in delivering our nuclear ambitions, and no one should take more credit for today's announcement than my tireless, tenacious and turbocharged honourable friend Innismarn. More investment by large businesses, more support for small businesses, promoting investment in our nations and regions, all part of a budget for long-term growth that sticks to our plan to deliver more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. I now turn to one of the most powerful ways to attract investment, namely supporting our most innovative industries. Outside the US, we have the most respected universities, the biggest financial services sector, and the largest tech ecosystem in Europe. We have double the AI startups of anywhere in Europe, double the venture capital investment, and a tech economy now double the size of Germany and 3 times the size of France. We're on track to become the world's next Silicon Valley. In today's budget for long-term growth, I take further steps to attract investment into our technology-related industries. I want our brilliant tech entrepreneurs not just to start here, but to stay here, including when the time comes for a stock market listing. So we'll build on the Edinburgh and Mansion House reforms to unlock more pension fund capital. We'll give new powers to the Pensions Regulator and Financial Conduct Authority to ensure better value from defined contribution schemes by judging performance on overall returns, not cost. We'll make sure there are vehicles to make it easier for pension funds to invest in UK growth opportunities. So I'm today publishing the names of the winners of the LIFTS competition. But I remain concerned that other markets, such as Australia, generate better returns for pension savers with more effective investment strategies and more investment in high-quality domestic growth stocks. So I will introduce new requirements for DC and local government pension funds to disclose publicly their level of international and UK equity investment, and I'll then consider what further action should be taken if we're not on a positive trajectory towards international best practice. I also want to create opportunities for a new generation of retail investors to engage with public markets. So we'll proceed with the retail sale for part of the government's remaining NatWest shares this summer, at the earliest opportunity, subject to supportive market conditions and value for money. We'll continue to explore how savers could be allowed to take their pension pots with them when they change job. We'll make it easier for people to save for the long term with a new British savings bond delivered through National Savings and Investment, offering savers a guaranteed rate fixed for 3 years. And today, following calls from over 200 representatives of the city and our high-growth sectors, I will reform the ISA system to encourage more people to invest in UK assets. After a consultation on its implementation, I will introduce a brand new British ISA, which will allow an additional £5,000 annual investment for investments in UK equity with all the tax advantages of other ISAs. And this will be on top of the existing ISA allowances, ensure British savers can benefit from the growth of the most promising UK businesses, as well as supporting those businesses with the capital to expand. And I turn now to our other growth industries, starting with clean energy. We want nuclear to provide up to a quarter of our electricity by 2050. And as part of that, I want the UK to lead the global race in developing cutting-edge nuclear technologies. I can therefore announce that Great British Nuclear will begin the next phase of the small modular reactor selection process, with companies now having until June to submit their initial tender responses. Our brilliant Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary will also allocate up to £120 million more to the Green Industries Growth Accelerator to build supply chains for new technology ranging from offshore wind to carbon capture and storage. By January of next year, as promised in the autumn statement, we'll have a new faster connections process to the grid up and running. In advanced manufacturing, we've announced a further £270 million of investment into innovative new automotive and aerospace R&D projects, building the UK's capabilities in zero-emission vehicle and clean aviation technologies. And I now turn to our creative industries. We have become Europe's largest film and TV production centre, with Idris Elba, Keira Knightley and Orlando Bloom all filming their latest productions here. Studio space in the UK has doubled in the last 3 years, and at the current rate of expansion, next year we will be second only to Hollywood globally. In the autumn statement, I committed to providing more tax relief for visual effects in film and high-end TV. I can today confirm that we will increase the rate of tax credit by 5% and remove the 80% cap for visual effects costs in the audiovisual expenditure credit. Having worked closely with the Culture Secretary and listened carefully to representations from companies like Pinewood, Warner Brothers and Sky Studios, we'll provide eligible film studios in England with a 40% relief on their gross business rates until 2034. And having heard representations from the British Film Industry Pact and indeed the Prime Minister, we will introduce a new tax credit for UK independent films with a budget of less than £15 million. For our creative industries more broadly, we will provide £26 million of funding to our preeminent theatre, the National Theatre, to upgrade its stages. And today I particularly want to recognise the contribution of our creative industries and the tourism that comes from orchestras, museums, galleries and theatres. In the pandemic, we introduced higher 45% and 50% levels of tax relief, which were due to end in March 25. They have been a lifeline for performing arts across the country. Today, in recognition of their vital importance to our national life, I can announce I am making those tax reliefs permanent at 45% for touring and orchestral productions and 40% for non-touring productions. Lord Lloyd Webber says this will be a once-in-a-generation transformational change that will ensure Britain remains the global capital of creativity. I suspect the new theatre reliefs may be of particular interest to the Shadow Chancellor, who seems to fancy her thespian skills when it comes to acting like a Tory. The trouble is, we all know how her show ends. Higher taxes, like every Labour government in history. I'm delighted they are cheering the fact that Labour governments always put up taxes. They're right. And I also want to mention our life sciences sector, where we will support research by medical charities into diseases such as cancer, dementia and epilepsy, with an additional £45 million, including £3 million for Cancer Research UK. But I have long believed we should be manufacturing medicines as well as developing them. So I can today also announce a brand new investment by one of our greatest life science companies, AstraZeneca, led by mon ami, the irrepressible Sir Pascal Soriot. AstraZeneca made their COVID vaccine available to developing countries at cost, as a result saving over 6 million lives. And today, because of the government's support for the life sciences sector, they announced plans to invest £650 million in the UK to expand their footprint on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus and fund the building of a vaccine manufacturing hub in Speke in Liverpool. More investment, better jobs in every corner of the country in a long-term budget for growth from a Conservative government. One of the biggest barriers to investment is businesses not being able to hire the staff they need. The economy today has around 900,000 vacancies. It would be easy to fill them with higher migration, but with over 10 million adults of working age who are not in work, that would be economically and morally wrong. Those who can work should. And this is an issue that I have tackled in every budget and autumn statement I've delivered. A year ago, I abolished the pensions lifetime allowance, which pushed doctors and others to take early retirement. Ask any doctor what they think about Labour's plans to bring it back, and they will say, don't go back to square one. In the autumn, with the help of our superb Work and Pensions Secretary, we announced the Back to Work plan, which will support 1 million adults with medical conditions and reduce the number of people assessed as not needing to work by 2/3. A year ago, I also announced the biggest ever expansion of childcare, extending the 30-hour free childcare offer. Just listen. Extending the 30-hour free childcare offer to all children of working parents from 9 months. We've not had a childcare plan from Labour, so you might want to listen to ours. Our plan will mean an extra 60,000 parents enter the workforce in the next 4 years, a tremendous achievement for the Education Secretary, who I think is doing an effing good job. And today, following representations from many people, including the CBI, I announced measures to support the childcare sector make the new investments it now needs to. So I am guaranteeing the rates that will be paid to childcare providers to deliver our landmark offer for children over 9 months old for the next 2 years. That is more people in work, more jobs, sticking to our plan in a long-term budget for growth. And I now turn to public services. I thought they were supposed to be interested in public services. I can wait.
Order. A little bit of murmuring is normal. I shouldn't be able to hear what you're saying over there. That is clearly out of order. Now, let's have some courtesy. Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Good public services need a strong economy to pay for them. But a strong economy also needs good public services. In 2010, schools in the UK were behind Germany, France and Sweden in the OECD's PISA education rankings for reading and maths. Now, after Conservative reforms, we are ahead of them. Burglaries and violent crime have halved in the last 14 years after we invested in 20,000 more police officers. Our armed forces remain the most professional and best funded in Europe, with defence spending already more than 2% of GDP. We're providing more military support to Ukraine than nearly any other country, and our spending will rise to 2.5% as soon as economic conditions allow. The NHS is still recovering from the pandemic, but has 42,000 more doctors and 71,000 more nurses than it did under Labour. That is 250 more doctors and 400 more nurses for every single month that we've been in office. Now, resources matter, of course, which is why, despite all the economic shocks we have faced, overall spending on public services has gone up since 2010, in the case of the NHS by more than a third in real terms. But although spending has continued to rise every year, public sector productivity still remains below pre-pandemic levels by nearly 6%. This demonstrates that the way to improve public services is not always more money or more people. We also need to run them more efficiently. We need a more productive state, not a bigger state. In autumn 2022, I set day-to-day spending to increase by 1% a year in real terms over the next Parliament. Some say that's not enough and we should raise spending by more. Others say it's too much and we should cut it to improve efficiency. Neither are right. It's not fair to ask taxpayers to pay for more when public service productivity has fallen. Nor would it be wise to reduce that funding given the pressures public services face. So I am keeping the planned growth in day-to-day spending at 1% in real terms, but we are going to spend it better. So today, they don't have a plan for public services like everything else, so why not listen to ours? Today I am announcing a landmark public sector productivity plan that restarts public service reform and changes the Treasury's traditional approach to public spending. And I start with our biggest and most important public service, the NHS. One of my greatest privileges was to be Health Secretary. Thanks to the NHS, I have 3 gorgeous children, the oldest of whom has been patiently listening in the gallery. The NHS is rightly the biggest reason most of us are proud to be British. But the systems that support its staff are often antiquated. Doctors, nurses and ward staff spend hours every day filling out forms when they could be...
Mr. Streeting,
when patients don't show up...
I don't like to interrupt the Chancellor. You're too close to me to be shouting that loudly. If you want to shout that loudly, you should come sit away up there. I apologise for interrupting the Chancellor.
When patients don't show up, or one member of a team is ill, operating theatres are left empty despite long waiting lists. Now, when we published the NHS long-term workforce plan, I asked the NHS to put together a plan to transform its efficiency and productivity. I wanted better care for patients, more job satisfaction for staff, and better value for taxpayers. Making changes on the scale we need is not cheap. The investment needed to modernise NHS IT systems so they're as good as the best in the world costs £3.4 billion. But it helps unlock £35 billion of savings, 10 times that amount. So in today's budget for long-term growth, I have decided to fund the NHS productivity plan in full. Yeah. With that new investment, we will slash the 13 million hours lost by doctors and nurses every year to outdated IT systems. We will cut down and potentially halve form filling by doctors using AI. We will digitise operating theatre processes, allowing the same number of consultants to do an extra 200,000 operations a year. We'll fund improvements to help doctors read MRI and CT scans more accurately and quickly, speeding up results for 130,000 patients every year and saving thousands of lives, something I know would have delighted my brother Charlie, who I recently lost to cancer. We'll improve the NHS app so it can be used to confirm and modify all appointments, reducing up to half 500,000 missed appointments annually and improving patient choice. We'll set up a new NHS staff app to make it easier to roster electronically and end the use of expensive off-framework agencies. And as a result of this funding, all hospitals will use electronic patient records, making the NHS the largest digitally integrated healthcare system in the world. Today's announcement doubles the amount the NHS is investing on digital transformation over 3 years. And on top of this longer-term transformation, we'll also help the NHS meet pressures in the coming year with an additional £2.5 billion. This will allow the NHS to continue its focus on reducing waiting times and brings the total increase in NHS funding since the start of the Parliament to 13% in real terms. The NHS was there for us in the pandemic, and today, with nearly £6 billion of additional funding, a Conservative government is there for the NHS. The head of the NHS, Amanda Pritchard, today says that this investment shows the government continues to back the NHS. She says that as a result of it, the NHS can commit to delivering 1.9% annual productivity growth over the next Parliament, more than double the average productivity growth in public services between 2010 and 2019. But today is not just about the NHS. I want this groundbreaking agreement with the NHS to be a model for all our public services. Across education, the police, the courts and local government, I want to see more efficient, better value and higher quality public services. So today I can announce that in the next spending review, the Treasury will do things differently. We will prioritise proposals that deliver annual savings within 5 years, equivalent to the total cost of the investment required. And today we make a start with some excellent proposals. Violence reduction units and hotspot policing have prevented an estimated 136,000 knife crimes and other violent offences, as well as over 3,000 hospital admissions. Every crime costs money, so we will provide £75 million to roll that model out in England and Wales. Police officers waste around 8 hours a week on unnecessary admin. With higher productivity, we could free the equivalent of 20,000 police officers over a year. So we will spend £230 million rolling out time and money-saving technology, which speeds up police response times by allowing people to report crimes by video call and, where appropriate, use drones as first responders. Too many legal cases, particularly in family law, should never go to court, and it would cost us less if they didn't. So we'll spend £170 million to fund non-court resolution, reduce reoffending and digitise the court process. Too many children in care end up being looked after by unregistered providers that are much more expensive. So we'll invest £165 million over the next 4 years to reduce that cost by increasing the capacity of the Children's Homes estate. Special education need provision can be excellent when outsourced to independent sector schools, but also expensive. So we'll invest £105 million over the next 4 years to build 50 new special free schools to create additional high-quality places and increase choice for parents. And we'll also put in place a plan to realise the tens of billions of savings recommended in an excellent speech by the head of the National Audit Office. The OBR say a 5% increase in public sector productivity will be the equivalent of around £20 billion in extra funding. With these plans, we can deliver that and more. And if we ensure they are cash-releasing savings, as we are committed to doing, it will be possible to live with more constrained spending growth without cutting services valued by the public. So, with the energy and drive of my talented Chief Secretary to the Treasury, we launch our public sector productivity plan in today's budget for long-term growth, more investment, more jobs, better public services, and one more thing, lower taxes. Keeping taxes down matters to Conservatives in a way it never can for Labour. We believe that in a free society, the money you earn doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to you. And if we want to encourage hard work, we should let people keep as much of their own money as possible. Conservatives look around the world at economies in North America and Asia and notice that countries with lower taxes generally have higher growth. Now, economists argue about cause and correlation, but we know that lower taxed economies have more energy, more dynamism and more innovation, and we know that's Britain's future too. Before I explain how we will bring down taxes, I start with some measures to make our system simpler and fairer. To discourage non-smokers from taking up vaping, we're today confirming the introduction of an excise duty on vaping products from October 26 and publishing a consultation on its design. Because vapes can also play a positive role in helping people quit smoking, we'll introduce a one-off increase in tobacco duty at the same time to maintain the financial incentive to choose vaping over smoking. I'll make a one-off adjustment to rates of air passenger duty on non-economy flights only to account for high inflation in recent years, and I'll provide HMRC with the resources they need to ensure everyone pays the tax they owe, leading to an increase in revenue collected of over £4.5 billion across the forecast period. Next, I turn to property taxation. In recent months, following tenacious representation from the honourable members for St Austell and Newquay, North Devon, cities of London and Westminster, Torbay and Truro and Falmouth, I have been looking closely at our furnished holiday lettings tax regime. I am concerned that this tax regime is creating a distortion, meaning there are not enough properties available for long-term rental by local people. So to make the tax system work better for local communities, I'm going to abolish the furnished holiday lettings regime. I've also been looking at stamp duty relief for people who purchase more than one dwelling in a single transaction, known as multiple dwellings relief. I see the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party paying close attention, given her multiple dwellings.
Order. Too much excitement. We haven't actually heard, because we can't hear what the Chancellor is trying to say. OK, and I can hear who is shouting there. You won't get to speak later. Chancellor.
I'm sorry to disappoint her, but multiple dwellings relief was not actually designed for her, but intended to... It was intended to support investment in the private rented sector, but an external evaluation found no strong evidence that it had done so and that it was being regularly abused, so I'm going to abolish it. And finally, as part of this budget, both the Treasury, a part of our look on property taxation, both the Treasury and the OBR have looked at the costs associated with our current levels of capital gains tax on property. They have concluded that if we reduced the higher 28% rate that exists for residential property, we would in fact increase revenues because there would be more transactions. For the first time in history, both the Treasury and the OBR have discovered their inner Laffer curve. So So today I'm going to reduce the higher rate of property capital gains tax from 28% to 24%. That really is for you, Angela.
I had enough from over there, definitely not having it from here. Chancellor.
I now turn to oil and gas. Unlike the party opposite, we want to encourage investment in the North Sea, so we will retain generous investment allowances for the sector. We'll also legislate in the finance bill to abolish the energy profits levy should market prices fall to their historic norm for a sustained period of time, after representations from the Honourable Member for Banff and Buchan. But because the increase in energy prices caused by the Ukraine war is expected to last longer, so too will the sector's windfall profits. So I will extend the sunset on the energy profits levy for an additional year to 2029, raising £1.5 billion. Next, I turn to the taxes paid by those who are resident in the UK but not domiciled here for tax purposes. This is a category of people known as non-doms. Now, Nigel Lawson wanted to end the non-dom regime in his great tax reforming budget of 1988, which is where I suspect the Labour Party got the idea from. But I, too, have always believed that provided we protect the UK's attractiveness to international investors, those with the broadest shoulders should pay their fair share. After looking at the issue over many months, I've concluded that we can indeed introduce a system which is both fairer and remains competitive with other countries. So the government will abolish the current tax system for non-doms, get rid of the outdated concept of domicile, and I aim to please all sides of the House in all my budgets. And we will replace...
Order. This is impossible. Right? Can you just... Order! Could you please shout more quietly? Chancellor.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will replace the non-dom regime with a modern, simpler and fairer residency-based system. From April 25, new arrivals to the UK will not be required to pay any tax on foreign income and gains for their first 4 years of UK residency, a more generous regime than at present and one of the most attractive offers in Europe. But after 4 years, those who continue to live in the UK will pay the same tax as other UK residents. Recognising the contribution of many of these individuals to our economy, we will put in place transitional arrangements for those benefiting from the current regime. That will include a 2-year period in which individuals will be encouraged to bring wealth earned overseas to the UK, where it can be spent and invested here, a measure that will attract onshore an additional £15 billion of foreign income and generate more than £1 billion of extra tax. Overall, abolishing non-dom status will raise £2.7 billion a year by the end of the forecast period. That is money the party opposite plan to use for spending increases, but today a Conservative government makes a different choice. We use that revenue to help cut taxes on working families. And many of those families, Madam Deputy Speaker, depend on child benefit. But the way we treat child benefit in the tax system is confusing and unfair. It's a lifeline for many parents because it helps with the additional costs associated with having children. And when it works, it's good for children, good for parents, and good for the economy because it helps people into work. But we currently withdraw child benefit when one parent earns over £50,000 a year. That means two parents earning £49,000 a year receive the benefit in full, but a household earning a lot less than that does not, if just one parent earns over £50,000. Today, I set out plans to end that unfairness. Doing so requires significant reform to the tax system, including allowing HMRC to collect household-level information. We'll therefore consult on moving the high-income child benefit charge to a household-based system to be introduced by April 2026. But because that is not a quick fix, I make two changes today to make the current system fairer. Following representations from my right honourable friends from Penistone and Stocksbridge, Carshalton and Wallington, Basset Law and West Worcestershire, along with many others, I confirm that from this April, the high-income child benefit charge threshold will be raised from £50,000 to £60,000. We will raise the top of the taper, at which it's withdrawn, to £80,000. That means no one earning under £60,000 will pay the charge, taking 170,000 families out of paying it altogether. And because of the higher taper and threshold, nearly 500,000 families with children will save an average of £1,300 next year. According to the OBR, this change will see an increase in hours amongst those already working to the equivalent of 10,000 more people entering the workforce. More investment, more jobs, better public service and lower tax. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is one further set of changes I want to make today. The way we tax people's income is particularly unfair. If you get your income from having a job, you pay two types of tax: national insurance contributions and income tax. If you get it from other sources, you pay only one. This double taxation of work is unfair. The result is a complicated system that penalises work instead of encouraging it. If we are to build a high-wage, high-skill economy not dependent on migration, if we want to encourage people not in work to come back to work, we need a simpler, fairer tax system that makes work pay. That is why I cut national insurance contributions in the autumn. By reducing the penalty on work, the OBR said that tax cut would lead to the equivalent of 94,000 more people in work. In other words, it would fill more than 1 in 10 vacancies throughout the economy. Lower taxes, more jobs and higher growth. Today, because of the progress we have made bringing down inflation, because of the additional investment that is flowing into the economy, because we have a plan for better and more efficient public services, and because we have asked those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more.
Order. Mr. Perkins. I can manage, thank you very much. 5 times I've heard what you said. I let you away with it. Now that's enough. One more strike and you're out.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do know how hard it is for them to listen to arguments for lower taxes. But that is the difference. Because we have asked those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more, today I go further. From April the 6th, employee national insurance will be cut by another 2p from 10% to 8%. And self-employed national insurance will be cut from 8% to 6%. It means an additional £450 a year for the average employee, or £350 for someone self-employed. When combined with the autumn reductions, it means 27 million employees will get an average tax cut of £900 a year. 2 million self-employed will get a tax cut averaging £650, changes that make our system simpler and fairer, and changes that grow our economy by rewarding work. The OBR say, when combined with the autumn reduction, our national insurance cuts will mean the equivalent of 200,000 more people in work, filling 1 in 5 vacancies, adding 0.4% to GDP and 0.4% to GDP per head. This is the second fiscal event where we've reduced employee and self-employed national insurance. We've cut it by 1/3 in 6 months, without increasing borrowing and without cutting spending on public services. That means the average earner in the UK now has the lowest effective personal tax rate since 1975. Their effective taxes are now lower than in America, France, Germany, or any G7 country, because Conservatives believe that making work pay is of the most fundamental importance, because we believe that the double taxation of work is unfair. Our long-term ambition is to end this unfairness when it is responsible, when it can be achieved without increasing borrowing, when it can be delivered without compromising high-quality public services. We will continue to cut national insurance as we have done today, so we truly make work pay. Madam Deputy Speaker, we stick to our plan with a budget for long-term growth. It delivers more investment, more jobs, better public services and lower taxes. But dynamism in an economy doesn't come from ministers in Whitehall. It comes from the grit and determination of people who take risks, work hard and innovate. Not government policies, but people power. It is to unleash people power that we today put this country back on the path to lower taxes. A plan to grow the economy versus no plan. A plan for better public services versus no plan. A plan to make work pay versus no plan. Growth up, jobs up, taxes down. I commend this statement to the House.
There we have an entirely predictable budget, exactly as brief, no surprises, absolutely terrible jokes. A lot of it weirdly appeared to be addressed to the opposition rather than to the public. Perhaps the Tories have decided that they are going to be in power after all. Keir Starmer, of course, will have to think on his feet here. He doesn't get any advance notice of what was said in the budget, although, given, as I said, that absolutely every single measure in it was leaked beforehand or briefed beforehand, that may not be quite as difficult as it sometimes is with other budgets. The key measures, if you're just coming in and haven't picked them up all the way through the budget, the 2p cut to national insurance, as briefed, did go ahead. There was some other news on growth and inflation and public spending. Growth next year, perhaps slightly higher than it's predicted. It then drops off at the end of the period, which is less good news, but certainly the fact that growth is up next year does give some good news where there has been generally not much. In terms of spending, there was a lot of prediction that the Chancellor would cut the spending envelope as we go forward. He didn't. He kept it at 1%. A little bit of an increase in NHS spending, though probably, as experts have pointed out, that will mean that it is, at the end of the day, flat. And the key point to remember on public spending is that we know spending in some areas is going up, and therefore there are going to have to be pretty severe cuts in places like local government. Neither main party has addressed how that is going to happen. So the Deputy Speaker, it's the Deputy Speaker who chairs the budget debate as chair of the Ways and Means Committee. She had a bit of a torrid time. If you're watching, you'll have seen it in the course of that debate, because there was a lot of barracking from the opposition. But as I said, one of the notable things, it seemed to me, listening to the Chancellor's speech, and I'm sure you will have seen this if you were listening, that a lot of it seemed to be addressed to the opposition benches rather than to the general public. So let's just have a look at what is happening in the chamber. We expect Keir Starmer to be up any second now. As I said, he's had a lot to go on. Normally, we have done in recent years, we've had a lot of the Chancellor briefing out what he or she has always been male chancellors is going to say on the day. But normally they do keep something back, the rabbit out of the hat at the end of the speech that wasn't briefed and therefore is a surprise to people. We actually didn't get that at all today. And I think the reason probably was that they're so worried about how far they are behind in the polls that they thought they really needed to land every single measure in this budget thoroughly with the public. And the easiest way to do that is to brief it out for days beforehand. So as we wait for Keir Starmer, let's get a rough summary again of where we are. Joel, can I bring you in here and just quick take as we wait for Keir Starmer on what you made of that?
Well, the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the independent forecaster that helps the government put together its budget, has just published its assessment of where we sit. As no surprise, Tom, it's a little bit more downbeat than the Chancellor was saying there. The big picture here is that inflation is easing, but you've actually got a situation where growth going out, growth forecast slightly better than the OBR expected, back in November, but not long term. Nothing spectacular here. In fact, stagnating for the next 5 years. They're saying that living standards will recover, as the Chancellor mentioned, from the record decline that we saw last year. But if you look at GDP per person, we've spoken about this before, the overall size of the economy divided by all the people living in it, and it points out the number of people living in Britain is rising. It's bigger than it was, and it continues to grow and is expected to grow further. GDP per head, a good proxy for living standards, slightly lower, Tom, in 5 years' time than it is today. The other thing we'd say is about really the moves the Chancellor's made here. He's delivered a couple of really shiny tax cuts, really chunky tax cuts. He's paid for them, yes, by scraping together smaller tax rises from places. And he says because inflation's easing, that's going to help him to be able to do it. And he hits his debt target 5 years hence. However, the headroom he's left himself against that target is absolutely tiny. This whole budget hangs on a target that's 5 years away and is extremely sensitive to very small movements in the forecast. I wouldn't bet your life on this actually happening. Is the only thing I'd say. This is stacked on a very unreliable and volatile moving target.
OK, well, if you're watching this at home and you're wondering why we're not listening to Keir Starmer at this point, that is because normally I don't know how many budgets I've covered in my life, and probably far too many to mention. Normally, Keir Starmer gets up immediately after the Chancellor to address a packed chamber. But as you can see, the chamber is almost empty, and we can't quite work out whether the Leader of the Opposition is going to get up or not, and therefore what may or may not have happened. So as soon as we can work out from Robert what on earth has gone on in the chamber there, we will tell you. But Joel, can I come back to you and talk about spending? Because we thought he was going to cut public spending to 0.75%. He kept it at 1%. I mean, you pointed out.
He thought that because he briefed it out.
He briefed it out, and then, oh, Lord, I'm not cutting it. But the point is, Labour have committed to that as well. And, as I said at the start of the programme, you have the chair of the Office of Budget Responsibility, let's just call that the government's watchdog, saying it's just worse than fiction. He doesn't believe it.
Yeah, I mean, look, even the Chancellor didn't do what he briefed out that he might do. He's not funded the tax cut by squeezing public services after the general election. But the Institute for Fiscal Studies will tell you they're being squeezed anyway. The situation as it stands is that unprotected departments, if you're not the NHF, you're not involved in the childcare plan, if you're not working in defence, these unprotected departments face £20 billion worth of cuts during the course of the next Parliament, unless something changes. So, yes, the squeeze isn't tighter than expected in November, but there's still going to be austerity in parts of public services, and public services are under strain. Now, the Chancellor's solution is do things better, productivity. He makes a fair point, Tom. We have more doctors, we have more nurses than we did before the pandemic, and yet we're not doing more stuff. The NHS is not obviously performing better, but it's a situation is that some of this is resource too. If you look at the number of hospital beds in Britain, if you look at the number of scanners, MRI scanners, PET scanners, we have less fewer of them in the UK than elsewhere. So it's not clear that this is just an efficiency thing. The suspicion here is there's resource too.
OK, that's Joel's take. Anushka, can I bring you in for yours?
Well, I think the reason they're going for the tax cuts, even if it doesn't feel as if they can afford them right now, is clearly because there's an election coming. There's going to be a big debate within the party about whether national insurance is going to take them far enough. National insurance, when it was last cut by 2p, didn't actually give them a big bounce. Interestingly, I was reading today that John Major cut national insurance just before announcing an election. They clearly thought back in 1992 that it would give them a boost, and it went on to do so. But if you look at all the other comparable factors right now, things are much, much more difficult for the Conservative Party right now. They're way further behind in the polls than John Major was even in 1992. And, as you said at the beginning of this programme, they're in a recession. Things are looking very, very difficult. People are not yet feeling better off. They're desperately trying to help people feel better off, for example, through the national insurance change. But with personal thresholds also frozen, I think it's going to be difficult.
There are a few things about that thing. First of all, terrible fattest joke against Keir Starmer. I don't know what they were thinking. Fat-shaming him, and just a terribly unfunny joke, even if it hadn't been fat-shaming. I mean, was it my imagination, or did he seem to be almost entirely speaking to the leader of the opposition, or the opposition benches, which I didn't understand? But lastly, everything trailed in advance. Really didn't feel like a party about to call a snap election. Yeah,
I mean, the one thing that that was the surprise, I guess, as of today, was the child benefit threshold rising. But for what it's worth, the sources I speak to don't think they're about to call a snap election. They think they're always planning for November. They think the reason they've gone for this slightly earlier budget in the year is to give them more room to do something later on. On top of that, talking to people in the Treasury in recent weeks, they have felt pretty miserable because they thought they were going to have more headroom than they actually had. But as Joel points out, I mean, and as our viewers must be confused by, how is it that one minute they've got billions more or billions less? It's simply because of forecasts, and people are becoming a bit less trustworthy of forecasts. I thought it was interesting how political he was in his jibes, or bad jokes, as you put them, to the opposition. Speaking to Labour, also a few for the Lib Dems, because the reality for Jeremy Hunt is he's actually facing big difficulty in his own seat in Surrey. The Lib Dems were there yesterday causing trouble for him. There's been reports about him spending a lot of money trying to shore himself up. I think he knows, as many of the MPs behind him know, that this could be a very difficult year for him.
OK, well, we can go to Robert, who is down in the House of Commons, and it can explain many things to us, including why we're not listening to Keir Starmer right now.
To be completely honest, Tom, I haven't got a clue because my head has been immersed in the book. And I think the main thing I want to talk to you about is quite what a significant tax-stimulating budget this is. In the year that we are about to enter, the tax year we're about to enter, so we think that will be the few months leading up to the general election, this is a tax stimulus of almost £14 billion, and indeed the total so-called policy decisions are £13.9 billion. Now that really is quite a shot in the arm to the economy, and as Joel and Anushka have just been talking about, one of the big issues is whether voters will give Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt any credit for that. And just to go through the important numbers here, the cut in employee national insurance hands something like £9.4 billion to millions of employees. The cut, 2 percentage point cut in self-employed national insurance is more than 700 million to those who are self-employed. The high-income child benefit, or the changes to the thresholds at which you start losing child benefit, that's worth more than £500 million to many thousands of families. And then when it comes to motorists, there's a giveaway of about £3 billion through, again, freezing fuel duty and not abolishing that 5p cut in fuel duty. So this is a fairly traditional, fairly naked pre-election set of bribes to millions and millions of people, most of them, however, in work. There is very little here for those who are traditional Tory supporters, and I'm talking in this case, obviously, about those who are retired. So very little in this budget for those who are older, who the Tories, to an extent, appear to be taking for granted.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Well, Anushka, we did have a lot of measures. I mean, maybe ones we'd mostly seen in advance, but there were a lot of measures. So could you summarise them? But before you get to that, do you have any idea why we're not watching Keir Starmer
yeah, we've
right
never
now?
seen this before, but in what one colleague calls elite trolling, the SNP objected to some of the tax changes, and that led to an immediate vote. So the MPs came out to actually vote, and then we will turn to that. But should I run you through some of the measures? There were, of course, those tax cuts. Jeremy Hunt confirmed that 2p tax cut to national insurance contributions. He'll be hoping for a bigger bounce than last time they did it. Lots of Tory MPs tell me they prefer income tax. He also raised the threshold on child benefits from £50,000 to £60,000 and announced wider plans to reform that system. How's he paying for it? Well, there was that new tax on vaping that we talked about before. He also extended the windfall tax on oil and gas producers. And he was met with jeers from Labour as he announced their policy to scrap the non-dom tax scheme. In other areas, there was more than expected to modernise NHS IT systems, £3.4 billion, although Labour pointed out that 10 years ago, Hunt urged the NHS to be paperless by 2018. He did extend the Household Support Fund, as we mentioned earlier, which councils use to support the poorest families. And he also froze alcohol and fuel duty. And as he did so, he listed the MPs from seats who he was listening to, seats like Stoke-on-Trent, like Dudley, like Glamorgan. What have they all got in common? They're all marginal. It feels like an election is coming at least this year, Tom.
OK, he did spend an awful lot of the speech addressing his own backbenchers as well, the Minister for so on, the MP for so on and so on and so on. Joel, we're almost out of time here, but final thought then to you.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think there's something in here about living standards, which I think this is, at the end of the day, it's what we care about more than anything else, right? It's how the tax and spending decisions and the outlook for growth and inflation, etc., affects us as individuals. And there is some good news here. The Office of Budget Responsibility points out we faced a real squeeze in 2022, 2023, but it is now forecasting that it expects living standards to recover more quickly than it was expecting just a few months ago. The biggest year-on-year drop in the since the 1950s, and we're now going to see a much faster recovery, mainly due to the fall in the market price of energy. Nothing to do with government policy, but government policy also playing a role here. The reduction of the main rates of national insurance contributions that we've heard of today, that we saw last November, provided a direct boost to living standards of about 0.5% per head. So you're in a situation here where living standards during the course of this year, if the OB are right, will continue to improve. When would you hold a general election?
Well, that's a very good question, which I won't answer just now. And I'll come to Anushka in a second, but I just want to ask you one final question. In summary, then, do you feel today, particularly with the slight upgrade for growth next year, if we're being honest, a little bit better news than you expected, or not really? Well,
there's not been an intensification of the squeeze on public services. He's financed another very eye-catching and chunky tax cut, in part by raising taxes over the next few years from elsewhere. The economic outlook looks a little bit better, but it's hardly spectacular. It's definitely not fantastic. And the whole, when the Chancellor says, I'm being fiscally responsible, we can afford that, he's saying that because he says that he's going to hit a target to get debt falling in 5 years' time. And he's left himself a gnat's room for manoeuvre against it. Debt is going to be rising for each of the next 4 years. Debt's not falling, and that was a pledge the government made. OK,
Anushka, can I come finally to you here then? It seems to me that, he deliberately shot the Labour Party's fox on non-doms. in various other ways, he closed off their room for manoeuvre. We didn't hear from the Leader of the Opposition for the reasons you said. Where does it leave the Labour Party then?
I mean, I think it leaves them in a difficult position. That non-dom status being removed was absolutely key to a number of Rachel Reeves' spending plans, including money, for example, for the NHS. And she has admitted in recent days, if that goes, then she is not going to suddenly magic up that money from elsewhere. When you speak to the Shadow Treasury team, they basically say, no, we're not going to raise any tax at all to do this. She wants to be fiscally prudent. I think it leaves her in a difficult position. And there were other little grenades in there as well, like extending things by 6 months, meaning whoever takes over after an election are the people who would have to make the decision on whether to carry on.
And can we just make the last point on tax? Because I just want to say, yes, he's cut taxes today, but the tax burden is going up every year. This is still going to be the biggest tax-raising parliament that we've seen for an awfully long time, because what he didn't mention is he's frozen the thresholds at which we start paying income tax and national insurance forever. And so there are going to be more people paying tax and more people paying tax at a higher rate. This is a tax-cutting budget, but not a tax-cutting parliament.
OK, there we are. We are nearly done here in the studio. You can hear Labour's response to the budget, finally, in full, with a speech from Sir Keir Starmer on our website, itvnews.com. If you're wondering how the budget affects you, our consumer editor, Chris Choi, will be answering viewers' questions at 7 o'clock tonight. You can email your question to your story at itv.com. Send us a message on ITVX, Twitter using the Ask Choi hashtag, or leave a comment on our Facebook page. And if you
and nothing they do between now and the election will change that. I mean, over 14 years, we've seen our fair share of delusion from the party opposite. A Prime Minister who thinks the cost of living crisis is starting to ease. An Education Secretary who thinks concrete crumbling on our children deserves her gratitude. A former Prime Minister who still believes crashing the pound was the right path for Britain.
Where is she?
And today, a new entry in this hall of infamy, the Chancellor, who breezes into this chamber in a recession and tells the working people of this country that everything's on track. Crisis? What crisis? Or, as the captain of the Titanic and the former Prime Minister herself might have said, iceberg? What iceberg? Smiling as the ship goes down, the Chuckle Brothers of decline, dreaming of Santa Monica, or maybe just a quiet life in Surrey, not having to self-fund his election. Whilst the crew behind them scrabble for DB News Budget. If only it weren't so serious, because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the story of this Parliament is devastatingly simple. A Conservative Party stubbornly clinging to the failed ideas of the past, completely unable to generate the growth working people need, and forced by that failure to ask them to pay more and more for less and less. And as the desperation grows, they torch not only their reputation for fiscal responsibility, but any notion that they can serve the country, not themselves. Party first, country second, while working people pay the price. Food prices still 25% higher than they were 2 years ago. Rents up 10%. An extra £240 a month for a typical family remortgaging this year, because they lost control of the economy, they sent interest rates through the roof, they made working people pay. They should be under no illusion. That record is how the British people will judge today's cuts, because the whole country can see exactly what is happening here. They recognise a Tory con when they see it, just as they did in November. Give with one hand, take even more with the other. Madam Deputy Speaker, people have been living through this nonsense for 14 years. They know the thresholds are still frozen, dragging more and more people into higher taxes. They know that a Tory stealth tax is coming their way in the shape of their next council tax bill. The Levelling Up Secretary has told not just this House, but every house in the country he's coming for their council tax. Give with one hand, gove in the other. But most insultingly of all, the British people know the only cause that gets this lot out of bed is trying to save their own skin. Take the desperate move, after years of resistance, to finally accept Labour's argument on the non-dom tax regime. Has there ever been a more obvious example of a government that is totally bereft of ideas? And if they're sincere in support of this policy now, then the question they must answer today is, why did they not do it earlier? Why did they not stand up to their friends, their funders and their family? Because if they had followed Labour's example, 3.8 million extra operations would have taken place by now. 1.3 million emergency dental appointments, free breakfast clubs for nearly 4.5 million children. But if instead this is just another short-term cynical political gimmick, then honestly, what is the point of them? What is the point of a party that is out of touch, out of ideas and nearly out of road? And we saw it last year as well, when only Labour's policies on the cost of living made the difference. For those opposite, now a little downbeat about another intellectual triumph for social democracy, I say get used to it, because with this pair in charge, it won't be long before they ask you to defend the removal of private school tax relief as well. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the harder they try with cynical games like this, the worse it will get for them, because the whole country can see exactly who they are, fighting for themselves, politics not governing, party first, country second. Madam Deputy Speaker, because we have campaigned to lower the tax burden on working people for the whole Parliament, and we won't stop now, we will support the cuts to national insurance today. But I noticed this, in 2022, when the Prime Minister was Chancellor, he made this promise. I can confirm in 2024, for the first time, the basic rate of income tax will be cut from 20 to 19 pence. Having briefed that all week that an income tax was coming, that promise is in tatters today. And of course, we support the fresh investment in our NHS, although I have to note that the Chancellor, when he was Health Secretary 10 years ago, promised to make the NHS paperless by 2018. And I know the Prime Minister's fondness for Elon Musk extends to an enthusiastic embrace of his community notes on fact-checking. So I'll say this bit slowly. Labour supports the fuel duty freeze. That is our policy. And I look forward to the Prime Minister's acknowledgement of that in coming days. We do ask the Chancellor can set out how we will make sure that this policy gets passed on to hard-pressed families at the pump. Yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, for all the fanfare around the tax measures today, that straightforward story remains true. Taxes, a 70-year high. The British people paying more for less. An unprecedented hit to living standards of working people. The first time they've gone backwards over a parliament, and they were cheering that today. And the reason is equally simple. There is no plan for growth. How can there be? He can say long-term plan all he likes. We see there are... Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, last year he announced 110 growth measures. He said we've turned the corner. And where are we now? Britain in recession. An economy smaller than when the Prime Minister entered Downing Street. The textbook definition of decline, that is their record. I mean, after 14 years, who do they actually think feels better off? Productivity is flat. Mortgages through the roof. House building off a cliff. Worklessness rising and rising. Homelessness never higher. Crime virtually unpunished. Children who can't see a dentist. Sewage in our rivers. Billions and billions of taxpayers' money wasted. 7 billion by the Prime Minister on COVID fraud alone. 500 million on the Rwanda scheme that has achieved precisely nothing. I can keep going. A railway line that will never reach our great northern cities. In fact, it might not even reach central London. Billions upon billions for a white elephant without a trunk. While today we learn taxpayers are picking up the bill for the Science Minister's libel. And all the time, one thing that is growing, the waiting list in our NHS, now nearly 8 million. They've had 14 years. 14 years running out of road. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is what decline looks like. And the complacency they've shown today, it takes your breath away. Britain deserves better than this. Britain deserves a real plan for growth, an end to 14 years of stagnation, wealth creation across the whole of the country, higher living standards for working people. This is the mission we need. But yet again, what we got was the same tired old formula, the sticking plasters, the chopping and changing, the party first, country second politics, with no repudiation of the utterly discredited idea that economic growth is something the few gift to the many. But even then, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think his backbenchers are owed an explanation. Because when the Chancellor says Britain has grown more quickly than countries like Germany over the last 14 years, I'm sure they will be shocked to learn that this is a statistical sleight of hand. And when it comes to GDP per capita, in other words, the growth that makes the difference to the pockets of working people, their record is much worse. Indeed, in per capita terms, our economy has not grown since the first quarter of 2022, the longest period of stagnation Britain has seen since 1955. In fact, the Chancellor invited us to look at those figures. The OBR says GDP per capita will be 0.75% lower in 2028 than was they forecast in November of last year. That was the number he said we should what? 0.75% lower in 2028. And they can call this a technical recession, but there's nothing technical about working people living in recession for every second the Prime Minister has been in power. This is a Rishi recession. And if the party opposite really wants to know what hides in the Chancellor's spreadsheets, then they will see that it's only the record levels of migration they have delivered which has prevented an even deeper decline. And that is the record they must stand on at the election. Because while on these benches we do not demean for a second the contribution migrants make to a thriving economy, it is high time the party opposite was honest with the British public about the role migration plays in their economic policy. Because right now, in terms of growth, that is all they have. There is nothing else. No plan to get Britain building again with a reformed planning system. No ambition to invest in clean British power for cheaper bills and energy security. No inclination to move away from insecure, low-paid jobs and strengthen employment rights so we can finally make work pay. Madam Deputy Speaker, where is the urgency on affordable housing? How can they look at Britain now and not see this as a massive priority? Never again will they be allowed to pose as the party of home ownership and aspiration. I have to say, given the disaster that's befallen his childcare plans, perhaps that's for the best. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the cost of childcare is a huge challenge for millions. Parents need him to deliver on his promise. And it seems the Chancellor's been taking lessons on marketing from the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow. All is not as it seems. And with just over 3 weeks to go, he has to come clean. Because up and down the country, parents need to know, will they get their entitlement in April, or is it just another of their reckless promises on governing? Headlines over delivery, promises without plans. policies that unravel at the first contact with reality. The lesson crystal clear that those who broke our economy cannot be trusted to repair it. The Tory credit rating is 0. It's time for change with Labour. And that's what today's budget should have been about. A last chance for the government to show it understands the economic reality of our volatile world, that global supply chains can be weaponised by tyrants like Putin, that a sticking plaster approach to public investment will cost Britain more in the long run, and that trickle-down nonsense means working people pay the price. It could even have been a moment of contrition, a reflection on their fiscal recklessness, an apology, perhaps, for the ridiculous chaos they've inflicted on businesses, communities and investors in this country. And yet still no sustainable industrial strategy, still no national wealth fund to crowd in private investment, still no urgency on speeding up critical infrastructure projects, and no recognition that they have left our standing as a country that always keeps its promises in tatters. And if they don't like that accusation, then look no further than the grotesque spectacle of ducking their responsibility to the victims of infected blood and Horizon scandal. One of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation history. Those were the Prime Minister's words just 2 months ago. Today, justice kicked beyond the general election. No, Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain can see exactly who they are. And the reality is there is no path to economic stability, no way to a calmer, less chaotic politics with the party opposite in power. Because chaos is now their worldview, a mindset that sees Britain's problems as opportunities they can exploit. Whether, like the Chancellor, that's out of desperation because they can't solve them, or whether, like the members for Fareham or South West Norfolk, they have no intention of solving them whatsoever. For a party this weak and divided, the end result is always the same. A vicious downward spiral. Chaos feeding off decline, decline feeding off chaos, while working people pay the price. The British people know this will not stop. 5 more years and it will only get worse. There will be no change of direction without a change of government. And that leaves Britain a nation in limbo, unable to shake off the Tory chaos that dragged us into recession and loaded the tax burden onto the backs of working people and maxed out the nation's credit card. Britain deserves a government ready to take tough decisions, give our public services an immediate cash injection, stick to fiscal rules without complaint, fight for the living standards of working people and deliver a sustainable plan for growth. So we say to the Chancellor and Prime Minister, it's time to break the habit of 14 years, stop the dithering, stop the delay, stop the uncertainty and confirm May the 2nd as the date of the next general election, because Britain deserves better and Labour are ready.
I'm not going to demand silence now. This is the moment for cheering. You can do that some more. Chairman of the Select Committee, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I know it hasn't been long since we had an autumn statement, but I still think that we heard today that the Leader of the Opposition has no plan. It's not been very long since we had the last forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility. So I thought it was interesting to read today that in the just over 100 days since they made their last forecast, there have been a lot of changes for the better in the UK economy. In particular, I'd like to highlight that they are expecting better inflation outturn than they were just over 3 months ago. They're expecting and have noted the sharper fall in interest rates that we all pay on the national mortgage. And they have also said that they're expecting living standards for the British people to recover more quickly than they were previously forecasting. And I think this is information that we can all welcome today, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I know there will be a range of views across this chamber about the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility. And of course, we all know that forecasts are all likely to be wrong. We will be scrutinising the Office for Budget Responsibility next Tuesday morning in the Treasury Select Committee, and we look forward to asking them the questions about their assumptions. But my view in terms of their role is a bit like the Sir Winston Churchill quote about democracy, that it's the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. So I think that although all economic forecasts are likely to be wrong in some way, and the Office for Budget Responsibility forecasts certainly often will not be the most accurate, I think it's a lot better than the alternative of either the Treasury marking its own homework, or indeed better than having a budget with no forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility at all, because I think it reassures the markets on which we are so dependent for our borrowing. Now, there's obviously been good and even better progress on inflation since the peak of over 11% after Putin's evil invasion of Ukraine. And it's vital that all of today's budget measures are looked at through the lens of the inflation, because we don't want to have anything that could prevent that progress towards 2% that the Bank of England is expecting by the middle of this year. And I think that we heard today from the Chancellor that he has looked through exactly that lens when he has announced the measures today. So there are a range of things that will really help. The 5 pence off the price of fuel at the pump going on for another year will be very helpful to drivers in West Worcestershire and elsewhere in the country. The freeze on alcohol duty will be welcomed in the pubs across West Worcestershire and across the country. And the public sector productivity plan, I think, is crucial to make sure that we get value for money from our public services. Now, when it comes to the second economic objective of